The first truck slowed on Route 9 the morning Ellie Sutton knelt in the ditch beside her grandmother's fence line, pressing seeds into soil that had never grown anything but fence posts and gravel. The driver was Hank Pruitt, and he didn't wave like he usually did. He just stared, rolled down his window, and called out, "You plantin' weeds now, Ellie girl?" She didn't answer. She never did. By noon, 3 more trucks had slowed. By supper, half of Millbrook Valley knew. Somebody's kid had seen that Sutton girl scattering handfuls of wildflower seed along the edge of her grandmother's cornfield, the exact strip of land every farmer in the valley kept bare on purpose, because flowers, everyone agreed, were for graveyards and highway medians, not for farmland that was supposed to earn its keep. At the feed store, men who hadn't spoken 2 words to each other all week suddenly had plenty to say. Waste of good dirt. Attracts weeds. Attracts trouble. Ruth ought to know better than to let her do that. Children repeated it at school, before they even understood what they were repeating. Ellie plants flowers instead of food, they whispered. The way kids whisper anything that sounds like it might be a little bit crazy. And through it all, 11-year-old Ellie Sutton kept kneeling in that ditch every evening after chores, seeds in her palm, dirt under her fingernails, saying nothing. Why flowers? Why there, of all places, on land that was supposed to be useless? And why? This was the part that unsettled people most. Why did she smile every single time she heard them laugh? Nobody in Millbrook Valley had an answer yet, but something was about to change on those farms. Something none of them could see coming, and it would start with the thing they'd mocked her for planting. If you've ever rooted for the quiet kid nobody believed in, you're in the right place. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's find out why one little girl's flowers were about to change an entire farming valley. Millbrook Valley wasn't the kind of place that changed easily. 3 generations of the same families worked the same soil, grew the same crops, and believed the same things their fathers believed. Corn, soybeans, a few orchards near the river. That was the valley's rhythm, and nobody questioned it, because questioning it had never once put food on the table. Ellie lived with her grandmother Ruth in a farmhouse with a porch that sagged a little more every winter. Her father had passed when she was 6, and since then, it had been just the 2 of them. 40 acres, an aging tractor, and whatever the harvest gave them. Money was tight in a way that didn't announce itself loudly. It showed up in patched overalls, in a truck that needed a new alternator nobody could afford yet, in Ruth quietly putting back the good coffee at the store and buying the cheaper tin instead. Ellie never complained about any of it. She wasn't the kind of kid who complained about much. She was quiet in the way that made adults forget she was in the room, which meant she noticed things nobody else did. The exact hour the barn swallows returned each spring, which fence posts the woodpeckers preferred, how the light changed color an hour before a storm, and she noticed the bees. Or rather, she noticed there weren't enough of them. It had started 2 summers back. An idle afternoon spent lying in the grass behind the barn, watching her grandmother's 3 apple trees bloom pink and white against the sky. She remembered, barely, the way you remember a smell more than a fact, that those trees used to hum. Actually hum, a low steady drone from dozens of bees working the blossoms at once. That summer, watching just as closely, she counted 4. 4 bees, for 3 whole trees. She didn't know what it meant yet, she just knew it felt wrong. The way an empty room feels wrong when you expect people in it. So she started paying attention the way she paid attention to everything. Quietly, patiently, without telling a soul. She noticed the ditches along Route 9 used to be thick with black-eyed Susans and clover before the county mowed them bare every spring to keep things tidy. She noticed the old Miller pasture, left wild for a decade after the Millers sold their cattle, was the one patch of ground in the whole valley that still buzzed the way she remembered the orchard used to. She noticed that the fewer wildflowers there were, the fewer bees there were, and the fewer bees there were, the smaller the apples got every August. Nobody had asked her to notice any of this, she just did. By the time she was 10, she'd started saving flower seeds from the roadside, Queen Anne's lace, clover, black-eyed Susan, drying them on newspaper on her windowsill, though she couldn't have said exactly why, other than a stubborn, quiet feeling that the empty places needed filling back in. Ruth found the jars of seeds one evening and asked what in the world she was planning to do with them. Grow something the bees like, Ellie said. Ruth didn't laugh, but she didn't understand either. Bees like clover, sweetheart. Clover doesn't pay the bank. It was the kindest version of the same thing everyone else would say, louder and less kindly. Once Ellie actually put seed in the ground. She chose the ditch first, the strip along the fence line that grew nothing but weeds anyway, land too narrow and too rocky to plant corn on. It seemed, to an 11-year-old, like the safest possible place to try something. Nobody would miss what wasn't being used. She was wrong about that. People noticed immediately, and not the way she'd hoped. Hank Pruitt's comment was the first, but not the last. Within a week, half the men at the feed store had an opinion, and none of them were flattering. Wildflowers meant seed heads blowing onto neighboring fields. Wildflowers meant weeds nobody could control. Wildflowers meant a young girl making a fool's decision with land that, small as it was, still belonged to a struggling widow's farm. "She's got Ruth's whole ditch line looking like an abandoned lot," someone muttered at church. Even the kids at school picked it up, repeating the word weird, the way children do when they've heard an adult say it first. Through all of it, Ellie kept planting. A little more each week, and every time someone laughed, she'd give the smallest smile, not smug, not defiant, just quietly certain of something she hadn't explained to anyone yet. That smile bothered people more than the flowers did. Because a girl who didn't seem embarrassed by being laughed at was a girl who knew something the rest of them didn't. The turn came on a Tuesday, in the dusty back corner of the county library, where Ellie had taken to spending her afternoons after chores. She wasn't there for homework. She was there because a librarian named Mrs. Alvarez, who'd noticed the same quiet, curious kid coming in week after week, had pointed her toward a shelf she didn't know existed. Books on pollinators, native plants, and the slow, invisible collapse of insect populations across farm country. Ellie read them the way some kids read comic books, cover to cover, night after night, a flashlight under the covers, when Ruth thought she was asleep. What she learned put a name to the feeling she'd had for 2 years. Bee populations across the country had been dropping for over a decade. Pesticide use, lost habitat, and the disappearance of the very roadside wildflowers everyone mowed down to keep things tidy. Fewer flowers meant fewer bees. Fewer bees meant less pollination. Less pollination meant smaller fruit, thinner harvests, and yields that quietly shrank year after year, so slowly that most farmers blamed the weather instead of noticing the real cause. It matched everything she'd already seen with her own eyes. The 4 bees on 3 apple trees, the wild Miller pasture that still buzzed, the empty mowed ditches everywhere else. She needed to know more, and books could only tell her so much. So on a Saturday morning, she rode her bike 4 miles to the edge of town, to a low white house with 3 dozen wooden hives stacked behind it, like a small city, the home of Walt Pemberton, the valley's last remaining beekeeper, a man most people considered a harmless relic of a hobby nobody needed anymore. Walt was 78 and hadn't had a visitor under 60 in years. He nearly dropped his water can when a girl he barely knew rode up asking if bees remembered, which flowers were good. They didn't remember exactly, he told her, settling onto an overturned bucket while she perched nearby. But bees communicated. Scouts found good forage and came home to dance out directions to the rest of the hive. A waggle, a wiggle, a message written in movement. And if a hive found nothing worth dancing about for miles, it didn't just struggle. It starved, quietly, the way everything in nature starves when nobody's watching. "Your granddad's orchard used to be the best in the valley," Walt said, and something in Ellie's chest went very still, because nobody had told her that before. Forage nearby went, though. Ditches got mowed, meadows got plowed under for another 5 rows of beans. Bees need something blooming close by, girl. Not just 3 apple trees for 2 weeks a year. "So if I planted flowers," she started. "You already are," Walt said, nodding at the mud still on her boots. "Questions whether it's enough, and whether it's the right kind, and whether anybody lets you keep doing it before they decide it's not worth the trouble." That last part worried her more than she let on, because the trouble was already starting. That spring, her wildflower strip had crept from the ditch to a narrow border along Ruth's side field, still small, still barely half an acre, but visible now, in a way the ditch planting hadn't been. And visibility, in Millbrook Valley, invited opinions. Ruth's oldest friend, Carol, pulled her aside outright. "Ruth, I love you, but you're letting that girl turn part of your field into a weed patch while you're behind on the loan. people are starting to talk about more than just the flowers. That stung, because it was true. Money was tighter than it had been in years, and every acre not producing corn was, on paper, an acre losing money it couldn't afford to lose. Ruth didn't scold Ellie over it. But one evening, tired and worn thin from worry, she asked her, gently, whether it might be time to let the flower patch go and put something useful there instead. Ellie didn't argue. She never did. She just asked for one more season. And something in the quiet certainty of her voice, the same certainty behind that maddening little smile, made Ruth agree, against her own better judgment. That was the hardest kind of doubt to carry, not the neighbors mocking her. Family, worried, tired, and running out of reasons to believe in something they couldn't see the point of yet. Ellie kept experimenting anyway. She planted strips in staggered patterns, so something was always blooming from April through October, instead of all at once and done, a trick from one of the library books, meant to give bees a steady food source instead of a single feast followed by famine. She kept a small notebook, the way Walt suggested, jotting down which flowers drew the most bees, which mornings she counted more butterflies than the week before, which patches the birds started visiting that hadn't visited before. Nobody asked to see that notebook. Nobody in town thought there was anything in it worth seeing. But the valley's real trouble hadn't even started yet, and when it did, it would arrive quietly, the way real trouble usually does, not with a warning, but with an empty orchard in full bloom, and no hum in the air at all. The following spring should have been the best bloom Millbrook Valley had seen in years. Every apple tree along the river came out thick with pink and white blossoms, more flowers than farmers could remember in a decade. Corn wasn't in the ground yet, but the fruit trees and the early squash blossoms were putting on a show, the kind of spring that usually meant a bumper harvest by fall. Instead, it was the quietest spring anyone could remember. The Hendersons noticed first, standing under their orchard on a warm April morning, straining to hear the low hum that usually filled the air on a day like that. There wasn't one. A few solitary bees drifted between branches, but nowhere near enough to work an orchard that size. By May, the worry had spread across every farm in the valley. Squash blossoms opened and closed, with almost nothing visiting them. Early bean rows, that should have been thick with pollinators, sat still and silent in the sun. Even old man Corbett, who'd farmed the same land for 50 years and didn't scare easily, admitted at the feed store that he'd never seen a spring this quiet. Nobody could agree on why. Some blamed a hard winter. Some blamed a neighboring county's new pesticide program. Some just shook their heads and said nature had its bad years, same as everything else. But the fear underneath all of it was the same. If the bees didn't come, the fruit wouldn't set. And if the fruit didn't set, it would be the leanest harvest the valley had seen in a generation. For families like Ellie and Ruth's, already stretched thin, that wasn't an abstract worry. It was the difference between making it through winter and not. And it was in the middle of that fear, in the last week of May, that something in the Sutton family's side field began to look different from everywhere else. Ellie's flower strip, the one everyone had mocked, the one Ruth had nearly asked her to plow under, was in full, staggered bloom, exactly as she'd planned it. And it was humming, not a few bees, dozens, then what looked like hundreds, drifting in from every direction, drawn to the one patch of ground in the valley, still offering something to eat. Walt's words came back to her the moment she saw it. Bees didn't need a miracle. They needed something worth dancing about. And for weeks, hers had been the only patch dancing. Word moved fast once people noticed, though at first, nobody wanted to admit what they were seeing. It was easier to assume it was a fluke, a warm pocket of weather, anything other than the flower patch they'd spent a year mocking. But the bees didn't stay in the ditch. They fanned out. Ruth's own side field, planted in early squash right beside Ellie's flower strip, began setting fruit at a rate the rest of the valley wasn't seeing. Then the Petersons, whose property bordered Ruth's on the east side, noticed their nearest rows of beans looking fuller than the ones farther from the fence line. Nobody said it out loud yet. It felt too strange, too small a thing to explain something this big. A patch of wildflowers, changing an entire crop? It sounded like the kind of thing people said to be kind to a little girl, not something a grown farmer admitted at the feed store. But Walt Pemberton drove out one afternoon in June, stood at the edge of Ellie's flower strip with his hands in his pockets, and said the one thing that made people start paying real attention. Hives within half a mile of blooming forage produce 3-4 times the yield of ones with nothing nearby, he said. You've got the only real forage source in this whole valley right now, Ellie girl. Every bee for a mile knows it too. It still wasn't proof. Not the kind farmers trusted. Real proof would take a harvest. Real numbers, side-by-side comparisons nobody could argue with. But for the first time, the whispers around town shifted. Instead of why is she wasting land on flowers, people started asking a different question. Quieter, almost reluctant. What if she was right? Nobody wanted to say it too loudly yet. Not until the numbers came in. By late August, the valley had its answer, and it came the way real answers usually do. Not with fireworks, but with a scale, a truck bed, and simple arithmetic that nobody could argue with. The Sutton farm brought in the best squash and bean yield Ruth had seen in 6 years. Not because of luck, not because of rain. Everyone had gotten the same rain. But because the rows closest to Ellie's flower strip had set fruit at nearly double the rate of rows, even 100 yards farther away. Ruth walked her own field with a mixture of disbelief and something close to shame, forever doubting her granddaughter, counting bean pods that should not, by any normal year's logic, have been that full. The Petersons noticed the same pattern on their side of the fence. So did the Hendersons, whose orchard bordered a stretch of county ditch Ellie had quietly reseeded the summer before, the one nobody had noticed until their fruit came in heavier than it had in a decade. Farther from any flowers, the story was different. Farms on the far side of the valley, with nothing blooming nearby all spring, had one of their leanest years on record. Thin fruit, sparse beans, the quiet spring finally showing up on the scale, in a way nobody could blame on weather anymore. The pattern was too clean to ignore. Farms closest to Ellie's flowers did better. Farms farthest away did worse. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was pollination. Plain and simple. The same lesson Walt had been trying to teach a valley that hadn't wanted to listen. People started showing up at the Sutton place that fall. Not with apologies, because that wasn't really how Millbrook Valley worked, but with questions. Hank Pruitt, of all people, stood at the fence line one October afternoon, studying the dried seed heads of Ellie's flower strip, like they held some kind of answer he needed. "What'd you plant here exactly?" he asked. "And where do a fella get more of it?" Ellie told him. Plainly, the way she told everyone, without a trace of gloating in it. Clover, black-eyed Susan, a handful of native mixes Walt had helped her source, planted in stages so something was always blooming. By the following spring, 3 farms had flower borders of their own, planted along fence lines and ditches that had been bare and tidy for as long as anyone could remember. Children who'd once repeated weird without knowing why now helped scatter seed along the school's back field because a teacher had heard the story and decided it was worth teaching. Ellie never got a trophy for any of it. Nobody threw a parade. What she got instead was something quieter and, in its own way, worth more. Farmers nodding to her at the feed store instead of shaking their heads. Walt inviting her out most weekends to help with the hives. And a valley slowly, stubbornly starting to hum again the way it once had. One flower strip at a time. Ruth never did apologize outright either. But one evening, watching the bees work the fence line at dusk, she put a hand on Ellie's shoulder and said the only thing that mattered. "I should have listened to you sooner." Ellie just smiled, the same quiet smile she'd worn through every bit of mockery, every doubt, every worried word, from the people who loved her most. It had never been about being right. It had only ever been about paying attention to the small, ignored thing everyone else had stopped seeing. Sometimes the smallest things people mock are the very things that end up saving them. If you had been one of her neighbors, would you have planted flowers or laughed too? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more true-to-life tales of resilience, nature, and ordinary people quietly changing their communities.